He saw her as nothing more than a clumsy intern, another shadow in his gilded skyscraper. But in the silence of a collapsing billion-dollar deal, her whispered words held a power that would either save his empire or shatter his world. Welcome to Epic Narrative Tales. If you are hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because I will be posting more creative stories just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The city of glass and steel was Alistair Sterling's kingdom, and from the 48th floor of Sterling Industries, he surveyed it not with the satisfaction of a king, but with the restless hunger of a conqueror who had already forgotten his last victory. The morning sun bled across the skyline, but Alistair didn't notice. His world was reflected in the polished obsidian of his desk, sharp angles, cold surfaces, and a single, unforgiving bottom line. He ended a call by snapping his phone into its cradle, the sharp click echoing in the cavernous office. It was the sound of finality, a dismissal. It was the sound most people heard from him. "Thompson," he barked into the intercom, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of impatience. "Where are the preliminary reports for the Al-Khoury deal? I wanted them an hour ago." "On their way, Mr. Sterling. The new intern is bringing them up now." Alistair's jaw tightened. The intern. The future of a 10-figure infrastructure deal is being ferried by a child who probably still thinks equity is a brand of yogurt. Get them here, now. He didn't wait for a reply, already turning his chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, the city moved like a circuit board, intricate and predictable. He saw patterns, opportunities, and threats. He saw assets and liabilities. What he never saw, not really, were people. People were variables, messy and emotional. They were tools, to be sharpened or discarded. At that exact moment, the tool assigned to deliver his reports was fumbling with her keycard outside the executive suite. Lena Al-Jamil held the sleek folder containing the Al-Khoury reports pressed against her chest like a shield. Her other hand, trembling slightly, struggled to align the card with the sensor. It was her third week at Sterling Industries, and she had spent most of it feeling like a ghost. She was a master of making herself small, of blending into the beige walls and muted carpets of the corporate giant. She kept her head down, her voice soft, her presence minimal. It was a survival skill she had perfected long ago. The light on the panel finally blinked green with a soft chime. Lena pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped into the lion's den. The air itself seemed different here, colder, sharper, smelling of expensive leather and an ambition so raw it felt metallic. And there he was, Alistair Sterling, standing with his back to her, a silhouette of power against the blazing morning. He was exactly as the whispers in the break room painted him, a titan, a predator, a man carved from granite and impatience. She took a hesitant step forward, her sensible flats making no sound on the plush rug. "Mr. Sterling." Her voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the immense space. He turned, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept over her. It wasn't a look of acknowledgement. It was a look of assessment, of categorization. He saw a plain, dark-haired girl in an ill-fitting blazer clutching a folder. She was furniture, an obstacle between him and what he wanted. "The reports," he said, his hand outstretched, palm up. It was not a request. It was a command. Lena hurried forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. In her haste, her foot caught on the edge of the antique Persian rug that was likely worth more than her entire college education. She stumbled, a small, mortified gasp escaping her lips. The folder flew from her grasp, papers scattering across the floor in a fan of white. One slide, a projection of market share, skated directly toward his gleaming Italian leather shoes, stopping just shy of the toe. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the frantic beat of Lena's own blood in her ears. She knelt, scrambling to gather the pages, her cheeks burning with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. Alistair didn't move. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't even speak. He just watched, his expression a mask of cold disdain. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a cruel, cutting sound, the sound of a man confirming his lowest expectations. "An intern," he muttered to himself, as if the word itself was an explanation for the chaos at his feet. "Of course." He nudged the errant paper with the tip of his shoe, a gesture of profound dismissal, before turning back to the window. "Leave them on the desk and get out." Lena's hands trembled as she stacked the last of the papers, her eyes stinging. She didn't look at him as she placed the now disheveled folder on the corner of his vast desk. She fled his office, her face flaming, the sound of his quiet, dismissive laughter echoing in her mind. She didn't slow down until she reached the relative anonymity of the intern cubicle farm, her chest tight with a familiar ache, the sting of being utterly and completely invisible. Later that night, long after the sun had set, the kingdom of glass and steel was dark, save for a few scattered lights. One was Alistair's. He was still working, fueled by black coffee and a relentless drive that left no room for anything else. His world was one of numbers and contracts, a fortress against the unpredictability of human connection. He was powerful, respected, feared, and he was utterly alone. Miles away in a small apartment that smelled of old books and cardamom, another light was on. Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by texts that had nothing to do with corporate finance. In her hands was a fragile, leather-bound book of poetry, the script a beautiful, flowing Arabic. Her grandmother's book. As she traced the words with her finger, she whispered them aloud. It was a dialect few people alive still spoke, a language of sand and stars, of nuance and soul. Here, in the quiet embrace of these ancient words, she wasn't a clumsy, invisible intern. She wasn't a ghost in a machine. Here, she was herself. Here, her voice was strong, her heritage was rich, and she was seen, if only by the ghosts of the poets who came before her. She was safe in her secret world, never imagining it was about to collide with the cold, hard empire of the man who had laughed at her.
The Al-Khoury delegation arrived at precisely 10 a.m. The main boardroom at Sterling Industries was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. A 30-foot table of polished mahogany, chairs of soft black leather, and a panoramic view of the city that served as a constant reminder of who held the power. At the head of the table sat Alistair Sterling, flanked by his senior executives. He was no longer the restless predator of his private office. He was the epitome of command, his suit impeccable, his smile a carefully calibrated instrument of charm and authority. Opposite him sat Sheikh Khaled Al-Fahad, a man whose quiet presence seemed to absorb the room's nervous energy. He was flanked by his own advisors, his face serene, his dark eyes missing nothing. In a discreet chair against the wall, almost perfectly aligned with a towering ficus plant, sat Lena Al-Jamil. Her task was simple: take supplementary notes, be invisible, and under no circumstances make a sound. She clutched her pen and notepad, her gaze fixed on the proceedings, a silent observer to a dance of giants. The meeting began smoothly. Two of Sterling's best translators, a man and a woman with decades of experience in diplomatic and corporate settings, were positioned near the head of the table. They flawlessly rendered Alistair's confident projections and the Sheikh's polite acknowledgments in crisp, formal Arabic and English. The initial phases of the deal were confirmed, figures were aligned, and a palpable sense of progress settled over the room. Alistair allowed a flicker of genuine satisfaction to cross his face. This was his domain. He was winning. Then, the atmosphere shifted. Sheikh Al-Fahad leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. The formal posture of negotiation softened into something more personal, more introspective. He began to speak, and Lena's pen, which had been gliding across the page, suddenly froze. The language had changed. The cadence, the vocabulary, the very soul of the words were different. It was no longer the sanitized universal Arabic of international business. It was the rich, poetic dialect of his homeland, the language of the majlis, of stories told over coffee, of promises sealed not by ink, but by honor. It was the language of her grandmother. The lead translator, a man named Jeffrey, faltered. His brow furrowed for a fraction of a second. The sheikh spoke of wanting to build not just a structure, but a landmark that would sing the song of our ancestors to the ears of our children. He used the term irq, not just meaning root or lineage, but carrying a deeper sense of an unbreakable foundational vein of heritage. Jeffrey, after a moment's hesitation, translated, "The sheikh wishes for the project to have a strong sense of cultural heritage." Lena flinched. The translation was not wrong, but it was hollow. It was like describing a symphony as a collection of notes. The sheikh's expression didn't change, but a subtle light in his eyes dimmed. He continued, speaking of the importance of barakah, a concept of blessing, of a venture imbued with a grace that transcends profit. He wanted to ensure the project would bring this divine abundance to the community. The second translator chimed in, rendering it as, "His Excellency is concerned with the project's long-term social and economic benefits." Again, correct, but lifeless. The spiritual core was gone. Alistair, oblivious to the nuance, nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. Our projections show a 15% community reinvestment, creating over 5,000 local jobs. The economic benefits will be substantial." It was the worst possible thing he could have said. It was like responding to a declaration of love with a spreadsheet. Sheikh Al-Fahad fell silent for a moment. He looked at Alistair, his gaze patient, but now laced with a clear disappointment. Then he spoke again, this time his voice softer, using an old Bedouin proverb. "A river that forgets its source will soon run dry." The translators exchanged a panicked look. They whispered to each other for an agonizing seconds. Finally, Jeffrey cleared his throat. "The sheikh is saying that we must not forget the foundational principles of our initial agreement." The proverb's meaning was completely lost. It was a warning about identity, about soul, about staying true to one's purpose. It was not about contracts. The misinterpretation hung in the air, a sour note in a finely tuned orchestra. Across the room, Lena felt a wave of nausea. She saw the chasm widening with every hollow word. She understood the sheikh's heart, and she could feel it closing. Alistair sensed the change instantly. The warmth was gone, the easy rapport had evaporated, replaced by a cool, impenetrable politeness. He couldn't understand the words, but he was an expert in the language of power, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was losing it. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his pen. "Is there a problem?" Alistair asked, his voice sharp,
cutting through the tense silence. He shot a venomous glare at Geoffrey, a look that promised consequences. The sheikh offered a placid, unreadable smile. He spoke a few final sentences in his dialect, his tone of impeccable courteous. The words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of a judge's verdict. Geoffrey, now visibly sweating, turned to Alistair. His face was pale. "Mr. Sterling, Sheikh Al-Fahad, thank you for the presentation. He says that while the numbers are impressive, he feels there is a gap in understanding between our two worlds that is perhaps too wide to bridge. He wishes you well in your future endeavors." The words detonated in the silent room. Future endeavors. The corporate euphemism for no. $1 billion, 2 years of work, the flagship project of Alistair's career, all gone. Just like that. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alistair's composure. It was followed by a surge of white-hot rage. He stared at his useless translators, at the placid face of the sheikh, at the deal turning to smoke before his eyes. His empire was built on control, and in this crucial moment, he had none. Sheikh Al-Fahad stood up, his advisors rising with him in a single, fluid motion. It was over. In her corner, Lena's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. "Say something!" a voice screamed inside her. "He's talking about his grandfather's first well in the desert, about honor, not money. Tell them!" But her throat was tight with terror. The memory of Alistair's mocking laughter filled her ears. An intern. Clumsy. Invisible. To speak now would be to invite that scorn, that dismissal on a scale she couldn't comprehend. Her hand trembled, and her pen slipped from her fingers, clattering softly onto the marble floor. The sound was insignificant, lost in the quiet rustle of the departing delegation, but for Lena, it was the sound of a key turning in a lock, imprisoning her with the terrible, silent knowledge of what she could have done. The deal was dead, and she had let it die.
The click of the boardroom door shutting was like the snap of a bone. It was the sound of finality, of a severed artery. For a full 10 seconds, the only movement in the room was the slow, silent drift of dust motes in the bars of sunlight. The senior executives stood frozen, like statues in a museum of failure, their gazes fixed on anything but the thundercloud of a man at the head of the table. Then, the storm broke. Alistair didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. The rage that erupted from him was far more terrifying. It was a low, controlled detonation of venom. He turned slowly, his stormy eyes locking onto Geoffrey, the lead translator, who seemed to shrink 2 inches under the weight of his gaze. "A gap in understanding," Alistair repeated, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a razor. "You stood there, the supposed bridge between 2 worlds, and you let a $1 billion chasm open up between us. Explain it to me. Use small words." Geoffrey paled, his professional composure crumbling. "Mr. Sterling, the dialect was obscure, highly nuanced, poetic. It wasn't standard business Arabic. He was speaking of intangible things." "Intangible things?" Alistair's laugh was back, but this time it held no humor, no mockery. It was the sound of grinding glass. "He wasn't speaking in riddles, Geoffrey. He was speaking a language you are paid an obscene amount of money to understand. You didn't just fail to translate, you failed to listen. He began to pace, his movements tight and coiled, a panther in a cage of his own making. He was resisting the brutal truth of the situation, that he, Alistair Sterling, had been powerless. His entire life was a monument to control, to bending the world to his will through sheer force of intellect and ambition. To have it all unravel because of words he couldn't grasp felt like a personal, intimate violation. It was a failure of his omniscience, and he couldn't accept it. It had to be someone else's fault. His furious gaze swept the room, cataloging his team's deficiencies. 2 years, he seethed, his voice rising now. 2 years of logistics, of planning, of projections. All of it undone in 10 minutes because my hand-picked team couldn't understand a simple metaphor about a river. From her corner, Lena felt every word like a physical blow. Her silence was a heavy cloak, suffocating her. It wasn't a simple metaphor, she screamed in her mind. It was a warning. It was the soul of the deal. The urge to speak, to correct him, was a painful, burning pressure in her chest. But what would she say? "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling, sir. Your world-renowned experts are wrong, and the clumsy intern you laughed at this morning holds the key?" The scene from that morning flashed in her mind. His dismissive gesture with his shoe, the cutting sound of his laugh. The shame was still a fresh wound. To speak now would be to tear it wide open. She resisted the impulse, clinging to her invisibility as if it were a life raft. Fear was a stronger master than courage. She justified her silence with a litany of rationalizations. It's too late now. They're already gone. He'd never believe me. I'd be fired on the spot. I'd be a laughingstock. She shrank further into her chair, her knuckles white where she gripped her notepad, her breathing shallow. She retreated so far into herself that she felt she might actually disappear. Alistair's pacing brought him near her side of the room. In his desperate, furious search for a target, for a reason, for anything to latch onto besides his own gaping failure, his eyes finally fell on her. He saw the intern, frozen beside the ficus plant. He saw her wide, dark eyes, and in them, he saw only one thing: fear. He interpreted her shell-shocked stillness as the paralysis of an incompetent child caught in the blast radius of adult affairs. He saw her as another symptom of the disease of mediocrity that had just cost him his prize. A flicker of pure, unadulterated contempt crossed his face. He didn't even address her directly. He turned to his chief of staff, Thompson, his voice dripping with scorn. "And her," he spat, nodding his head in Lena's direction. "Get her out of my sight. I want everyone who was in this room who did absolutely nothing to be gone. The dead weight goes first." The word struck Lena with the force of a physical slap. Dead weight. It confirmed every fear, every insecurity. She was nothing. A piece of furniture that had failed to be useful. The last ember of her courage was extinguished, smothered by the cold ash of his disdain. She didn't need to be told twice. She stood on numb legs, her head bowed, and practically fled the room, not daring to look back. She didn't see the flicker of something other than anger in Alistair's eyes as she watched her go. A flash of profound, frustrated confusion. He had all the power in the world, and none of the answers. As Lena hurried down the pristine, silent hallway, her mind was a whirlwind of self-recrimination. She had been a coward. She had held the key, a golden, intricate key passed down from her grandmother, and she had been too afraid to even show it to the man standing before a locked door. Back in the boardroom, the executives had begun to file out, eager to escape the toxic atmosphere. Soon, Alistair was alone. The silence returned, heavier this time, filled with the ghosts of lost opportunities. He stood before the vast window, looking down at his city, his kingdom. But for the first time in a very long time, it didn't look like a conquest. It looked fragile. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany table, the sharp crack echoing the splintering of his own certainty. He had resisted the truth of his failure, but the evidence was all around him. He was lost, and the map was written in a language he couldn't read.
Lena didn't make it to the elevator. She reached the end of the long, art-lined corridor and leaned against the cool marble wall, just out of sight of the boardroom, trying to force air into lungs that felt like they were collapsing. Dead weight. The words echoed, each repetition a fresh sting. She closed her eyes, fighting back the hot burn of tears. She had failed. She had failed her grandmother's memory, failed her own potential, and now all she wanted was to escape the suffocating luxury of this place and run back to the safety of her small apartment and its silent, understanding books. The soft chime of the elevator arriving was her signal to leave, but just as she pushed herself off the wall, the heavy boardroom doors opened again, and the low, resonant murmur of Arabic filled the hallway. The sheikh and his delegation were leaving. Instinct took over. Lena flattened herself against the wall, trying to merge with the ridiculously expensive abstract painting, hoping they would pass without noticing the disgraced intern. Sheikh Al-Fahad was in the lead, walking with an unhurried grace that belied the tension of the last hour. As he passed her hiding spot, he spoke quietly to his chief advisor, his voice laced not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. He repeated the proverb, the one that had been so brutally misunderstood. نَحَرْ يَنْسَى مَنْبَعُ يَجِفُّ قَرِيبًا. A river that forgets its source will soon run dry. But then he added something more, a quiet sigh of a phrase. وَمَعَ الْأَسَفِ لَمْ يَجِدُوا أَحَدْ هُنَا لِيَفْهَمْ لُغَةَ الْمَنْبَعِ. And it is a shame that no one here could understand the language of the source. That was it. That was the spark that ignited the tinder of Lena's shame and fear. It wasn't an insult. It was a lament. A quiet mourning for a connection that was never made. He wasn't dismissing them. He was grieving the gap between them. And in that moment, it was no longer about Alistair Sterling's deal or her job. It was about her grandmother's voice. It was about the honor of a language that was being mistaken for noise. Before she could think, before the paralyzing fear could reassert its grip, her body moved. She took one step out from behind the painting, her heart a wild bird in her chest. Her voice, when it came out, was trembling but clear, imbued with a respect that was utterly genuine. She spoke in his dialect, the words as natural to her as breathing. عفوا يا شيخ، لكن ذاكرة النحر ليس في منبعه فقط، بل في الحجارة التي صقلها. Forgive my intrusion, Sheikh, but a river's memory is held not only in its source, but also in the stones it has polished along the way. The world stopped. Sheikh Al-Fahad, who was halfway to the elevators, froze mid-stride. His advisors, his security, everyone, they all stopped, turning as one to stare. It was so quiet Lena could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. The sheikh turned his head slowly, his dark, intelligent eyes finally landing on her, truly seeing her for the very first time. There was no dismissal in his gaze. There was only pure, unadulterated shock, followed by a dawning, intense curiosity. He responded in the same dialect, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. Man anti ya binti? Who are you, my daughter? Just then, another door down the hall flew open. Alistair Sterling emerged from a private office, his face a mask of controlled fury, his chief of staff, Thompson, trailing nervously behind him. He had obviously been strategizing, trying to find a way to salvage the wreckage. He saw the scene in the hallway, the entire Saudi delegation halted, captivated by the intern. His brain stuttered, unable to process the image.
The dead weight was holding the attention of the man who had just walked away from $1 billion. "What is going on here?" Alistair demanded, his voice sharp with irritation as he strode towards them. "Thompson, escort the sheikh and his men down." But the sheikh didn't move. He held up a hand to Alistair, a gesture that was both polite and absolute, his eyes never leaving Lena. "One moment, Mr. Sterling. This young woman, she speaks the language of my home, not the language of translators, the language of poets." Alistair stared, his mind racing, connecting the dots with frantic speed. Her strange, focused expression in the boardroom, the delegation's sudden halt, the impossible, undeniable fact that something was happening here that he did not understand but desperately needed. The abyss of his failure yawned before him, and this girl, this clumsy, invisible intern, was suddenly standing on the other side, holding a rope. Desperation bulldozed pride. There was no time for questions, no room for ego. There was only the raw animal instinct to seize this one inexplicable chance. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his stormy gaze shifting from the sheikh to Lena and back. The contempt was gone, replaced by a bewildering, high-stakes intensity. He looked at Lena, and for the first time, he spoke to her as if she were a person, not an object. "You," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You understand what he was saying in there." Lena, caught between the gravity of the sheikh's attention and the force of Alistair's desperate focus, could only manage a small, terrified nod. That was all he needed. A switch flipped behind his eyes. He was no longer a defeated CEO, he was a commander launching a counterattack. "Sheikh Al-Fahad," Alistair announced, his voice ringing with a newfound, albeit shaky authority. "It appears we have had a regrettable communications failure. I insist you grant me 10 more minutes of your time. In my office." Then he turned his full attention to Lena. The command was absolute, but beneath it was a silent, desperate plea. "You, with me, now." He didn't wait for an answer. He gestured sharply toward his office, a silent order for the sheikh to follow, and then fixed Lena with a look that made it clear that refusal was not an option. The circumstances had just bound them together with chains of iron. His entire empire, his pride, his future, it all now rested on the shoulders of the intern he had so cruelly dismissed. And as they all began the short, tense walk towards his office, Alistair Sterling was forced into the one position he never tolerated: dependency. Alistair's office, which had felt so vast and intimidating that morning, now felt like a pressurized chamber. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and the monumental weight of $1 billion deal hanging by a single, fragile thread. Sheikh Al-Fahad sat not in one of the guest chairs, but on the plush leather sofa, a gesture that subtly shifted the dynamic from a corporate negotiation to something more personal. Alistair remained standing, unable to be still, his restless energy a stark contrast to the sheikh's composed stillness. And in the middle of it, in a chair that felt like a witness stand, was Lena. She had become the sole conduit, the only bridge across the chasm that had opened in the boardroom. Alistair would speak, his words clipped and precise, and Lena would translate, her voice soft but steady. Then the sheikh would respond in his rich, nuanced dialect, and Lena would render his meaning back into English. It was a surreal and terrifying experience. The fate of Sterling Industries was flowing through her, and the pressure was immense. But as she spoke, a strange thing happened. The fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence. This language, her grandmother's language, was a part of her. Speaking it felt like coming home. She wasn't just translating words, she was conveying intent, emotion, and cultural subtext. When Alistair mentioned profit margins, she translated it using a term that evoked a prosperous harvest for all. When the sheikh spoke of wafa, a deep loyalty that extends beyond contracts, she explained it to Alistair not as trust, but as a bond of honor, like that between brothers. Alistair watched her, his initial bewilderment morphing into a grudging, then profound sense of awe. This was not the clumsy girl who had scattered papers at his feet. This was a woman of incredible hidden depth. She moved between the two languages with an effortless grace that his highly paid experts could never have managed. She was not just a bridge. She was the architect, rebuilding the deal on a foundation of genuine understanding. After 20 minutes, the core misunderstanding had been rectified. The deal was back on the table, resurrected from the dead. Sheikh El-Fahad held up a hand, signaling a pause. He looked at Alistair. Then his gaze settled on Lena, his expression warm and paternal. "Mr. Sterling, your project has a strong foundation. But this young woman—"
An hour later, the delegation was gone. The signed preliminary agreement, worth more than the GDP of a small country, lay on Alistair's obsidian desk, yet he hadn't looked at it once. The triumphant calls to his board, the celebratory emails, the proud announcements, all of it could wait. They felt strangely unimportant, like echoes from a world he no longer fully inhabited. The cavernous office was silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the cold, empty silence of isolation. It was a shared quiet, filled with the resonance of the last hour. Lena was still there. She had gathered her notepad and pen and was standing near the door, reverting to her self-effacing posture, ready to disappear back into the anonymity from which she had been so dramatically pulled. "You can go, Lena," Alistair said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He used her name, and the simple act of it felt revolutionary. She nodded, her hand on the door handle. "Yes, Mr. Sterling." "Wait." She paused, her back still to him. He struggled for a moment, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. The language of command was his native tongue. The language of genuine inquiry was one he was only just learning. "The proverb," he said finally, "the one about the river's memory and the polished stones. What did it mean?" Lena turned around slowly. He wasn't standing behind his desk, his fortress of power. He had moved to the window, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city lights beginning to prick the twilight. He seemed smaller, somehow, more human. "It's an old saying my grandmother used to use. It means that a person's or a people's identity isn't just about where they came from. It's about the journey they've taken, the hardships they've endured. The struggles are what shape us, what make us smooth and strong, like stones in a riverbed." Alistair was quiet for a long time, absorbing that. He thought of his own journey, the relentless grinding work, the sacrifices, the betrayals, the loneliness. He had always seen them as scars, as the cost of doing business. He had never considered that they might be the very things that gave him his substance. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," he said, still not looking at her. It was a statement of fact, a simple offering of truth. "She was," Lena whispered, a sad, fond smile touching her lips. "She was the strongest person I've ever known. When she came here, she had nothing. People heard her accent, saw her clothes, and they dismissed her, just like—" She stopped herself, catching the words before they could tumble out. "Just like you dismissed me." The unspoken accusation hung in the air between them, more powerful than if she had shouted it. Alistair finally turned from the window to face her, his expression stripped of all its usual arrogance. What was left was something raw and unguarded. "You dismissed me," he finished for her, his voice a low gravel. It was not an apology, not yet. It was a confession, a simple, stark acknowledgement of his own blindness. I'm not good at seeing what's right in front of me, he admitted, the words tasting like rust. I see bottom lines and market shares. I forget to look for polished stones. It was a clumsy metaphor. His attempt to speak her language, and the effort of it, the sheer vulnerability of it, cracked open a tiny fissure in the wall Lena had built around her heart. She took a hesitant step back into the room. "Why do you do it?" she asked. The question so direct it surprised them both. He actually considered the question. No one had ever asked him why. They asked him how. "My grandfather," he said, his gaze becoming distant. "He built this company from nothing. Came here with holes in his shoes and a single ruthless idea. He never stopped running. He used to say, 'The moment you stand still is the moment they catch you.' I guess I've just been running from they my whole life." A fragile, unexpected thread of connection shimmered in the space between them. The grandson of a relentless immigrant, driven by a fear of failure. The granddaughter of a displaced poet, clinging to her heritage to survive. Both shaped by the ghosts of their ancestors. Both running from something. Both, in their own way, profoundly lonely. "My grandmother used to say something different," she offered softly. "She said, 'The quietest pools often run the deepest.'" Alistair looked at her, truly looked at her, and a slow, genuine smile, the first one she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. "She was definitely wiser than my grandfather." The tension in the room had dissolved completely, replaced by a delicate, peaceful intimacy. For the first time they weren't CEO and intern. They were just two people in a quiet room at the end of a long day, sharing stories of the grandparents who had defined them. It felt safe. It felt like a truce. It felt, for a fleeting, beautiful moment, like the beginning of something that might heal them both. "Lena," he said, his voice earnest, "what you did today, thank you." "You're welcome, Alistair," she replied, and the sound of his first name in her mouth felt both impossibly bold and perfectly natural. The healing, it seemed, had already begun. The next morning, the atmosphere at Sterling Industries was electric. News of the resurrected Al-Karori deal and the mysterious intern who had saved it had spread through the building like a shockwave. As Lena walked to her cubicle, the sea of anonymous faces parted slightly. People looked at her differently. The whispers that followed her no longer ones of dismissal, but of awe, confusion, and in some corners, envy. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, and it was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation. She received a short formal email from Alistair's office, officially reassigning her as a special consultant to the Al-Karori project, effective immediately. It came with a staggering pay increase. It was a professional victory, but what truly made her heart lift was the single line at the bottom, clearly typed by Alistair himself. "I'm looking forward to learning more about polished stones." A warm, hopeful feeling bloomed in her chest. Last night wasn't a dream. The connection was real. The truce held. But in the world of glass and steel, truces are fragile things. On the 40th floor, Harrison Vance, a senior vice president who had been the original lead on the Al-Karori deal, was staring at his computer screen, his face a mask of cold fury. He had been publicly humiliated, his team and translator shown up by an intern. Now Alistair was parading her around as the company's savior. It was an intolerable shift in the power structure. For Harrison, this wasn't about the deal. It was about survival. He spent the morning making quiet calls, digging into Lena Al-Jamal's file. An intern from a state university, no special commendations, assigned to archival work. and yet she was a world-class expert in an ultra-rare Bedouin dialect? It was too perfect, too convenient. He began to weave a narrative, twisting facts into a web of insidious suspicion. He drafted a confidential risk assessment memo and sent it directly to two of the most conservative members of the Sterling Industries board. By lunchtime, the poison had begun to seep into the foundations of Alistair's victory. He was summoned to a priority video conference with the board members. They were polite, but firm. They voiced concerns. How could they have been so unaware of Ms. Al-Jamil's unique skill set? Why did she remain silent when the deal was first collapsing? Her linguistic ability was too precise, too coincidental. Was it possible she was a plant, a relative of the Sheikh's placed to gain leverage? The word spy wasn't used, but it hung in the air like a toxic gas. "The optics are a nightmare, Alistair," one of them said, his voice a smooth, corporate purr. "It makes you look compromised, as if you were manipulated by an employee." Every word was a trigger, reactivating Alistair's deepest programming. The moment you stand still is the moment they catch you. He was being caught. His authority was being questioned. His moment of human connection was being reframed as a professional liability, a moment of weakness. He ended the call, his jaw set like concrete. The trust he had felt, the warmth, it all curdled into the familiar cold acid of suspicion. Had he been a fool? Had her story about her grandmother, the tears in her eyes, been an act? A brilliant, calculated performance to secure her place? He hated himself for thinking it, but he hated the idea of being played even more. He summoned Lena to his office. She arrived a few minutes later, a hopeful, nervous...
The next morning, the corporate world was buzzing. Alistair Sterling had called a company-wide emergency press conference. Rumors were flying. Was the Al-Khoury deal off again? Was there a hostile takeover? Harrison Vance walked into the main auditorium with a smug, confident stride, taking a seat in the front row reserved for senior executives. He had won. The intern was gone, and he was already drafting his recommendations for a more secure consulting team. Alistair walked onto the stage. He didn't stand behind the podium. He stood in the open, the harsh lights revealing an exhaustion and a gravity on his face that no one had ever seen before. He looked out at the sea of employees, his gaze sweeping over them until it landed, for a brief, cold moment, on Harrison Vance. "Good morning," Alistair began, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the microphone but carrying an unusual intimacy. "I'm sure you are all wondering why I've called you here. Yesterday, this company nearly lost the most important deal in its history, and then it was saved. It was saved by the courage and unique brilliance of one person." A murmur went through the crowd. "There have been whispers," Alistair continued, his voice hardening, "and calculated, malicious rumors designed to cast a shadow on that person's integrity. I am here this morning to set the record straight. The failure to communicate with Sheikh Al-Fahad was my failure, and that of my senior leadership. Not our translators, not our consultants, but mine. I had the right pieces on the board, and I was too blind to see their value." He looked directly at Harrison Vance. "I have also learned that these rumors were initiated and spread by a member of my executive team, in an effort to undermine a colleague and sow discord for personal gain. As of 10 minutes ago, Harrison Vance is no longer an employee of Sterling Industries." A collective gasp went through the auditorium. Harrison's face went from smug to ashen in a single devastating moment. "But I'm not here to talk about him," Alistair said, dismissing the man with his gaze. "I'm here to talk about integrity and honor." He paused, letting the words settle.
The person who saved this deal is named Lena Al-Jamil. She acted not for leverage, but out of a deep respect for her own heritage and a desire to bridge a gap in understanding that the rest of us were too ignorant to even see. She is a woman of profound character, and my actions toward her in the face of corporate pressure and my own cynicism were inexcusable. I publicly and personally apologize to her for questioning her integrity. She represents the very best of what this company should aspire to be: insightful, courageous, and deeply human. He had never spoken such words in his life. He was dismantling his own legend, brick by painful brick. He was trading his reputation for ruthlessness for a chance at redemption. He ended the conference without taking questions, leaving a stunned and silent auditorium behind him. He had done what he had to do for the company. Now he had to do what he had to do for himself. Lena was in her apartment, packing a small box with the few personal items she had kept at her cubicle. She felt a profound sense of relief, the calm that follows a devastating storm. It was over. She was free. She was about to put her grandmother's book of poetry into the box when a knock came at her door. Her heart leapt into her throat. It couldn't be. She opened the door a few inches, and there he was. Not Alistair Sterling, the billionaire CEO. Just Alistair. He wasn't wearing his armor-like suit, but a simple sweater. He looked tired and profoundly nervous. He wasn't holding a briefcase. He was holding the small, worn book of poetry she had left on his desk. "Lena," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its usual command. Can I come in?" She hesitated for a long moment, then stepped back, allowing him into her small sanctuary of books and memories. He looked around, taking in the world she had built for herself, so different from his own. His gaze fell on a framed photograph on her bookshelf, a beautiful, smiling woman with Lena's eyes. "Your grandmother?" he asked softly. Lena nodded, her throat tight. "She's beautiful," he said. Then he extended his hand, offering her the book. "This belongs to you." She took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was like an electric shock, a jolt of the connection he had so brutally severed. "I saw the footage, Lena," he said. "I saw everything. I saw your fear, and I saw your courage. What I did, what I said to you, there's no excuse. My grandfather taught me to see threats everywhere. He never taught me how to recognize a gift." He took a deep, shaky breath. "I was wrong, and I am so sorry." The apology was simple, raw, and utterly sincere. It wasn't a corporate maneuver. It was the confession of a man who had stared into the abyss of his own character and been horrified by what he saw. Lena felt the hard, protective shell around her heart begin to crack. He then did something that stunned her. He spoke, his accent clumsy and his pronunciation flawed, but his intent perfectly clear. He spoke a phrase in her grandmother's dialect. "Ana wajata el-lu'la fil sahra." "I found the pearl in the desert." Lena's eyes filled with tears, and this time she let them fall. He had gone to the sheikh. He had asked him for the words. He had made the effort to cross the bridge into her world, to speak the language of her heart. It was the grandest gesture she had ever known. "I don't want to offer you a job, Lena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I forfeited the right to be your boss, but I was hoping you'd give me a chance to learn how to be your friend, to get to know the granddaughter of the desert lark, to see the person I was too blind to see." He stood there, completely vulnerable. his entire being stripped down to this one honest request. He had made his choice. He had chosen vulnerability. He had chosen the truth. Now she had to make hers. She looked at the man before her, a man who had torn down his own empire just to find his way to her doorstep. She looked at the book in her hands, a symbol of her past, and she saw the possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine. The quietest pools often run the deepest. And she realized, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that he did too. A slow, watery smile spread across her face. "A river's memory is also in the stones it has polished," she said softly, echoing the words that had started it all. He understood. It was an acceptance, a forgiveness, an invitation. "Come in, Alistair," she said, opening the door wider. He stepped inside, leaving the cold, lonely world of glass and steel behind him, and for the first time walked into the warmth of a home. The deal was for $1 billion, but what they had found in the wreckage of pride and prejudice was something utterly priceless. It was the beginning of their real story, an unexpected love found not in a boardroom, but in the quiet language of the heart.
Alistair's final gesture was to learn a single phrase in Lena's language to show he was willing to enter her world. Thank you for watching this video to the very end. What was the most meaningful gesture someone has ever made to show you they truly see you for who you are? Share your beautiful stories in the comments below, like this video massively, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more emotional journeys like this one. I would really appreciate it if you could get us to 1,000 subscribers. See you in the next story. Bye.